Hi, I'm Kenzie. Welcome back to my podcast. If you're just joining, welcome. Today we will be talking about my 5th Blue's Clues VHS, Blue's Discoveries. This VHS includes what experiment does Blue want to try, and what does Blue want to make out of recycled things. Yes, I know, long titles. First, let's talk about what experiment does Blue want to try. This episode starts out with Steve with an apple and saying that he and Blue are experimenting. Suddenly, a splash is heard. It turned out that Blue was just experimenting with her own apple. Yes, the apple did float. Steve further explains that he and Blue were doing the sink-float experiment and wonders if his apple would sink or float. The viewer says float. We were right. The green apple floats just like the red one. Pretty cool, huh? Then Steve wondered what else they should use for the experiment. Blue didn't want to try that experiment again. The question was, what experiment does Blue want to try? That's when Blue wanted to play Blue's Clues. But first, Steve had to get rid of the paw print by experimenting with a magnet. He used the magnet to get the handy-dandy notebook, too. Of course, it was a little difficult to get it off, but he got it. He's strong. And so the game Blue's Clues has begun. We enter the kitchen and notice that paprika floats. That's when the viewer spotted the first clue, which is water. Afterwards, Steve wanted to try another experiment by guessing how many Steve steps it would take to get to the garden. It turned out it took 7 Steve steps. We then see Shovel and Pail who are experimenting with nature. That's when Steve found his magnifying glass. He, Blue, and the viewer wanted to experiment too. By using the magnifying glass, everything looked bigger. Our job was to figure out what the object is. There was a ladybug, grass, and even Steve's hand. After the experiment was over, Steve went back inside and noticed the nooks and crannies in the corkboard and the threads in the curtain. Then Steve discovered something blue and paw-printy. That's when the viewer spotted the second clue, which is tape. Afterwards, it's mail time. Mailbox came in upside down because it was part of an experiment. When Steve received the letter, it too was upside down. He turned it right side up and we find our friends experimenting with magnets. And Steve replies afterwards that magnets are magnificent. Then Steve and Blue noticed a shooting star in outer space. They become superheroes and skidoo into outer space. They have fun floating around. Then Steve saw Saturn, or maybe he thought it was Mars. Then the sun enters the scene to tell us about the solar system. Okay, I love the solar system. That's where I learned it. So anytime you talk about a certain planet, I would be there. Now the solar system song was the most fun song I have ever sung. After the sun sang the song, it was Super Steve's turn to name the planets with a little help, of course. We did it successfully. After singing the song one more time, Steve said that it was time to go back to Earth to search for the last clue. He then mentions that in outer space has no gravity, but Earth does. No floating on Earth. That's when the viewer spotted the third clue, which is 2 empty plastic bottles. And that's when Steve realized we have all 3 clues and it was time to sit in the thinking chair. It was time to think. We were trying to figure out what experiment Blue wants to try, and our clues were water, tape, and 2 plastic bottles. At first, Steve thought Blue wanted to take the water in the plastic bottles and get the tape and tape all over them. That was wrong. It is a waste of tape. Then Steve wondered what if water was poured in one of the plastic bottles and then get tape and tape the other plastic bottle to the top. Then we could just swirl it around, which it makes a cyclone experiment. Blue wants to try the cyclone experiment. At this point, Steve realized we just figured out Blue's clues. After the celebratory song, Steve and Blue go to the table and begin the cyclone experiment. First, they used the funnel and poured water into one of the empty plastic bottles. That's when Shovel and Pail entered the scene again because they wanted to see the cyclone experiment too. Now the next step was to tape the second plastic bottle to the first one while Steve held it upside down. That's when Mailbox came. Then Steve mentioned that after it was all taped up, we get to swirl it around. That's when Neptune came. Everyone was here and we were ready to try the cyclone experiment. Steve picked the bottles up, swirled them around, and it looked just like a real cyclone. Everyone oohed and awed. Now, if anyone doesn't know what a cyclone is, it's like a tornado. After a fun day, it was time to say so long but sing just one more song. Now let's talk about the episode as a whole. I feel like kids can learn a lot if they want to learn about science. The Planet song will always be my favorite science-y song. In fact, it's the only science-y song I know. All in all, it's a good episode. Now let's talk about what does Blue want to make out of recycled things. This episode starts out with Steve inviting the viewer in to help him and Blue clean up. They were almost done. Steve picked up empty tissue box and put it in the wastebasket. Then the viewer spots an empty milk carton and Blue puts it in the wastebasket. Then Steve wondered if it would be great if they could make something out of the trash instead of throwing it away. In other words, recycle. The question was, what does Blue want to make out of recycled things? That's when Blue wanted to play Blue's Clues, but first Steve had to get rid of the paw print. Better yet, they could recycle it. How, you ask? Blue takes it, and we know how she's going to use that paw print later. And so the game Blue's Clues has begun. But before we continued further, Steve wanted to wash his hands because they were a little messy from all the trash. That's when the viewer spotted the first clue, which is a paper towel roll. After the first clue was found, we hear voices in the background saying, "Recycle" 3 times. It turns out that the voices were coming from the recycle bins, paper, plastic, and metal. They all asked if we were ready to recycle, and we agreed. Steve sure needed help from the viewer with this one, because this was a big job. Our job was to sort the trash into the correct bins. So the empty soup can went into metal, the empty juice bottle went into plastic, the empty milk carton went into paper, and finally the aluminum foil went into metal. Yes, aluminum foil is metal. Steve accidentally knocks the wastebasket over and did not realize that the empty tissue box still needed to be recycled. That's when the viewer spotted the second clue on the tissue box. After the second clue was found, we hear alarm bells coming from Tickety Talk. She was trying to figure out what she could make out of old stuff to recycle them. We decided to help her. So the things she had were buttons, leftover colored paper, and an empty coffee can. At first we weren't sure what Tickety could make until Blue had an idea. She covered the coffee can with the paper, put buttons in it, put the lid on it, and shook it like a maraca. After making music with the homemade maraca, it's mail time. Mailbox had something he needed to throw away, but instead he needed to recycle it in the paper bin. In the letter, our friends showed how to recycle clothes to make paper. Let me tell you, the entire process was pretty cool. After mail time, Blue showed Steve a whole recycled town she made and skidooed right in. Steve did too. This is where we meet Al Luminum, or Al for short, mayor of Recycle Town. Al needed help recycling some stuff. We needed the cup to make a telephone, the tire to make a tire swing, and the plastic soda holders to make a net to play ball, of course. Now this scene was quite entertaining because Al could not get Steve's name right at all. He called him Stu, Stone, and Stan until he finally correctly called him Steve. Steve called Al Sal in return. After jesting, Steve hears music coming from a rubber band. That's when the viewer spotted the third clue on the rubber bands. And that's when Steve realized we had all 3 clues and it was time to sit in the thinking chair. It was time to think. We were trying to figure out what Blue wants to make out of recycled things. And our recycled clues were a paper towel roll, an empty tissue box, and rubber bands. Steve wondered what if we put the rubber bands over the tissue box and the paper towel roll attaches. We could make a guitar. Blue wants to make a guitar by using the empty tissue box as the body, the rubber bands as the strings, and the paper towel roll as the neck. At that point, Steve realized we just figured out Blue's clues. After the celebratory song, Blue went to make the guitar. Paper, plastic, metal, Tickety, and Al join in, some musical fun. After Al asked Tickety how she made that maraca, it was time to say so long, but sing just one more song. Now let's talk about the episode as a whole. I feel like kids can learn a lot in this episode if they want to learn more about recycling and take care of the earth. Come to think of it, I care fondly of the earth. That's why I recycle every day. Very important. All in all, it's a good episode. So yeah, that's Blue's Discoveries. If you would like to play again, just go back to the beginning of the episode. And remember, you can do anything that you want to do. Bye!